it seems to have been a common theme amongst our reactors that insights and data should be a going concern in order for us to improve public transport, the importance of public engagement. Um, there's nothing wrong with riding Grab for as long as we're able to design, as Barry has mentioned, a system that makes multiple modes of transportation viable. And again, you've also mentioned a common theme amongst other reactors, which is making sure that we deliver better service. But I think it's also important that you added that we consider the environmental impact of of poor public transportation. Lastly, you've mentioned that only 40% of jeepneys are back, and that you've raised a question about until when can we sustain it. But I think maybe the better question is until when are we going to allow our public to endure this kind of service. As Jed has mentioned in his talk, the state of public transportation has been bad even before the pandemic. So, question is how long? How much longer are we going to allow them to endure it? We are running out of time, but I'm going to pick three quick questions from our Q&A board. Um, okay, are from Amelia Hernandez. Do you think that I guess for anyone, do you think that the minimum wage of workers across the Philippines? Do you think that the minimum wage of workers be also the same across the Philippines to provide too much commuting from far places converging to Manila? Uh, who would like to answer that question? Jed, perhaps I can throw that question over to Jed. Would you mind uh, answering that question, Jed?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, sir?
No problem. Amelia is asking, do you think that the minimum wage of workers should be the same across the country to provide commuting from far places and or from people converging to Manila?
So the topic of this decentralization has been being discussed a lot of times as a proposed solution. Actually, it's difficult to say because there's no like empirical evidence yet that if we do something like a same minimum wage across the whole of the Philippines, or it would help like in the congestion or improving commuting and mobility. What would be better is that what let's look at it. Let's take a step back and look at it from a bigger picture. Metro Manila is growing, but a lot of other places in the Philippines are also growing too. So Metro Manila is just the first of the major. I mean, it's the pioneer city, but all other cities that will come, like Cebu, Davao, Iloilo, Bacolod, and other emerging cities also, like in let's say Baguio and in Naga, for example, um, will continue to experience the mobility problems that we are experiencing now in Metro Manila. So instead of always thinking of like ways to decongest, like why not tackle the problem directly and think about how do we make our city more inclusive and sustainable? Because we already know that from the the World Bank already said that we're all, I mean, the whole of the world is becoming more urbanized. So we maybe become more like 60% urbanized in 2050, and 90% of that will come from Africa and Asia. Um, and what we need to do is really tackle how to provide people-centered mobility in our cities. How do we make the densest cities and tackle the most difficult problems and make it sustainable and inclusive? And that would be the better way to solve this kind of question. So sorry for not answering it directly. So again, in summary, I don't know yet if that particular intervention will help, but the general um, my general opinion about this is to tackle the problem more directly rather than always diverting it to the congestion kind of approach.
Right. Thank you, Jed. Okay, second question. Taxing businesses for their traffic impact. What do you guys think about that? Maybe while we have you, Jed, you can answer that question quickly.
Okay. Sige. um, I think it's a good question, no? Well, first, I think that businesses should always think about how to minimize the negative impacts of their business operations anywhere they do, not just for congestion, but social impact, environmental impact, and of course for traffic. Um, I don't know if well, definitely they have to minimize it and also compensate for whatever negative impact they do. But I don't know if taxes would be the best approach. Maybe it could work, but maybe it can be done through other means also. Like these businesses have to follow like certain guidelines, like for example, street design guidelines that they have to ensure that their businesses would create not a negative impact but a positive impact. So as businesses, they have to be a partner in making our society and our communities better. But maybe taxing private entities can help. But maybe the other panelists and reactors would have another opinion on that.
Do any of the other reactors want to add anything? Or
I think
Let me give it a shot first. When you talk about any tax measure, you have to look at it from two perspectives. One is as a regulatory measure, and another as a revenue measure. As a regulatory measure, I think we really should be discussing what behavior are we attempting to dissuade, or put another way, what behavior are we attempting to discourage? If you're talking about small businesses, it's a hole in the wall somewhere in a residential area where it just so happens that they have a popular dish, and so they draw a lot of traffic. If you tax that kind of business, you're just going to put them out of business. And particularly in the post-COVID environment, one of the major challenges will really be how are you going to promote SMEs. A lot of SMEs were really hit because of COVID, and I don't think that taxing them further will be something that we should be talking about at this point. In fact, the opposite. We should be talking about incentives for these kinds of businesses. But that said, it might work as a regulatory measure if you're talking about certain businesses past a certain threshold, like malls, for instance. The other side, which I think is equally important, is that if you look at it as a revenue generating measure, what are you going to be spending the money on? And we're going to go back to what we were talking about earlier. It's not enough to have the budget. Yeah, it should also be clear that you should have plans in place that, okay, we're going to raise this money. We're going, and to a certain extent, the act of extracting these taxes will in a way push a certain behavior that we want pushed already. But we also need to be able to have a place to put that money. And putting it in a place which will also support the overall objective that we're doing. If it's going to be a local tax, it should be clear what the local government is going to use it for. If it's going to be a national tax, it should not only be clear what it's going to be used for, but what particular areas it is intended to benefit. Because obviously, we're talking about national taxes. There's a much broader range of venues in which that particular fund can be spent, and all of that has to be taken into account when you're pushing for any tax at the national level in the first place.
Thanks, Barry. I guess that goes along the lines of what you mentioned earlier of, bigger funding has to go hand in hand with better plans. Okay, thanks, Barry. Before we wrap up, I guess there's room for one more question, and I'd like to. Oh, sorry. Do we have one more
I
reactor?
think Philip was going to mention something there.
Oh, I'm
or
so
is
sorry.
it already okay?
I'm so sorry.
Well,
Go ahead.
a lot has already been said now, but I think one of the challenges there is it's hard to quantify what is traffic impact or footprint. Is it the business's employees using cars? Is it the business's services using vehicles like delivery? Is it them being in certain avenues, for example, not being in a wall which encourages people to drive, customers to get to their place? I think those, that's one of the challenges, right, around trying to incentivize or disincentivize certain things. And I think, one of the things that came to mind when I saw this, I'm reminded of Singapore, which has, mandated sort of chips on all of the cars, and then they have these gantries on all of the highways and all of the city centers, so that whenever you pass by it, you're charged a road. I forget what it's called, but you're basically charged a fee for driving on the road, right? And then, of course, that's not including even the ridiculous tax that you have on owning a vehicle as well. But I think, so on one hand, that's like an easy way of doing it, right? Because, if it's company cars, then it's going to get charged. But I think one of the challenges really when thinking about that is you have to remember that these things are systems, and you have to think about what unintended consequences you might have. I'm reminded of the sort of color coding scheme, although really it's a plate number coding scheme where, the idea was we'd limit the amount of vehicles on the road, but what ended up happening was there are certain maybe more privileged households that ended up buying more cars, and then that actually ended up with more cars on the road, right? And the same goes for like corporations that might have fleets. Now they just have more cars in their fleets. So it's really a challenge of like, yes, you want to target a specific factor, but also you need to consider the system as a whole as well. I could speak more, but I don't want to take too much time because I know we're running late.
Thanks, Philip. That's actually pretty interesting. You mentioning the difference between determining the difference between footprint and foot traffic. And as you've also mentioned in your talk, it's really very important to be extra careful whenever we craft policies. I think you're referring to congestion taxes when you're talking about the chips and the gantries in Singapore.
Oh, yeah.
And something that I think was also raised earlier, also last year. I think as one of the ways to address congestion in Manila. Okay, so we have room for one last question, and I want to ask this of Jed and all our other reactors. We've been talking about improving mobility and transportation. Out mobility has been added for a year, and yet our discussion, the question is the same all the time. So quickly, to Jed and other reactors, what's the biggest hurdle? Is it a what? Is it a who? We have you on camera now. Philip, perhaps we can start with you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I think that's a huge problem, right? Like, and it's difficult because there's so many things one can point at. You can talk about policies, you can talk about infrastructure, you can talk about incentives, you can talk about, I like to talk about systems and how you have a lot of things in play. And I think one of the things, if I can attempt to sort of unpack, it's a very big question, is that a lot of the solutions, I think, and I gave the example of the number coding scheme earlier, tend to sort of try and address symptoms maybe, or certain specific factors, right? And I think when you do that, certainly it can alleviate certain things, but there can be other things that propagate, right? Like the whole idea of maybe the solution is to put more infrastructure, more roads. On one hand, intuitively, it sounds, more roads means more space for cars, which means less traffic, but you might incentivize people to drive more. You might create a transport network that's actually less efficient, as Jed has already mentioned. And there's one thing that I really like coming back to, which is Breas paradox, which was come up with a traffic engineer. His name is Breas, obviously, where you can add roads to a network and that actually makes the traffic worse just because of the way the graph is constructed, right? So if you're not careful when you just sort of make all of these band-aid solutions, you can sort of make the problem worse. So when you ask what is the biggest hurdle, I think it might be that attitude of making patchwork solutions, which is why I'm a big fan of like things that attempt to change very things that are small and deliberate and make these big systemic changes. I touched on the example of service contracting, and I hope that's a good solution because that's it changes the dynamic, right, between operators and drivers and the people that ride these services. And it's the kind of systemic thinking I think is necessary. But again, the devil is in the details as to how it's actually implemented, right? So, it's hard for me to point the finger at any one thing or person or entity, but the common attitude I think I see is maybe too narrowly thinking about solutions to specific things without considering it from a systems perspective.
Great. Thanks so much, Philip. Barry, can we ask for your thoughts on this?
To a certain extent, I echo Philip's statement. Although I will point to a reason why that there is a tendency to focus on band-aid or short-term solutions. And that's really because we have a 6-year planning horizon for anything. If you look at the experience of other countries, take Japan, for instance, they had really a multi-decade transportation plan in place. And it was cemented to a certain extent through legislation. So regardless of changes in administration, they had a plan. Obviously, it was not set in stone. There were changes made through the years, but you had an overall direction that guided any initiatives or interventions on this particular issue. Here, a new administration comes in and they basically throw out everything that was discussed in the past 6 years. They come up with their own plan, and if they don't, and if the next guy that comes in is somebody else, then chances are that plan will be this plan will be thrown out as well. So I suppose we have to find a solution on how to extend our planning horizon beyond the limits of a 6-year presidential term. I don't know whether that can be done through passing a law and then expect that law will provide a solid framework to be followed by subsequent administrations, or whether that's just going to add another layer of planning that will simply be disregarded by whoever in power, whoever will next be in power. But definitely this is an issue that has to be addressed. Obviously, a lot of the interventions, particularly when you're talking about resource-intensive public transport infrastructure, you can't just talk about 4 years, 5 years, 6 years to do it all. You will really have to talk about longer time frames insofar as that is concerned. And if you're going to talk about a really drastic policy shift, as Jed was talking about earlier, changing the mindset for policymakers and planners, you have to have some kind of guarantee that mindset will carry over despite changes in the political environment. And so I think that's really one of the biggest challenges that we have to overcome. And honestly, I don't have any answer yet as to how cross that particular bridge or overcome that particular hurdle.
Thanks, Philip and Barry, for your very safe answers. Ces, can we hear from you?
I didn't even dare. I didn't dare. I think that's a mouthful to even kind of flesh out. But I guess like everybody else here, we all want to see something that would not hurt, I guess, the larger population, right? I mean, I speak for MSME when I say that it's already hard enough as it is, right? So anything that could put on more pressure, I think we would rather reserve it for other things. I'm gonna be even safer and just say I have no comment on that. I don't want to dare.
Thank you, Ces. Jed, would you like to venture out into something else? Thank you, Ces.
Well, you already mentioned answers, but really, I think our car-centric mindset definitely has to go out. We need to shift our mindset from being car-centric into a people-centered one. So we need to push first the hashtag commuters naman. But really, the reform needs to start from us, the people. I think a lot of the successful reforms in transportation, um, such as in South Korea and in the Netherlands, they all started from the people, and also in the US. So we need to have a collective voice really pushing for this kind of mindset. But again, because our culture would have like a lot of people still having this car-centric mindset, it's very difficult for us to really combine and have a collective voice and pushing for this kind of reform. But I really think that through, I mean, the start of the a lot of advocacy groups now, and with the Move as One coalition, um, we are now starting to have that kind of voice that everyone is now starting to gather, as you know, the people, as civil society. We want to push for this, and now with this kind of voice, the government is now paying attention or giving more attention to us, and is now thinking about more programs and investment in better public and active transport. So I think that we just need to push for this kind of movement. Uh, yeah.
Thanks, Jed. I just want I received a message from Elroy, who unfortunately had to leave. To add to the discussion, is saying if we're trying to change behavior to prefer non-car centric modes, taxation like that is not the correct policy solution. And in addition to what Barry is saying, short planning horizon is exasperated by our procurement process. So thanks for tossing that in, Elroy. I guess to sum up, everybody's final safe answers. It's very important to address symptoms. Um, and then to be really in order to create a policy shift, we need to be able to craft better and more sustainable plans that look at systems as a whole and not just piecemeal solutions. In order for us to shift, for us to shift to more car-centric design.